folks. Layman Pascal here on the Integral Stage Meta Podcast, where we podcast podcasters, broadcast broadcasters, and generally dig in wherever anyone's trying to bring forth higher, deeper, or more transformative ideas through online projects. Today, we're going to check in on the Game B social network with a friend of the show, the pistol-toting Joseph Goebbels of metaphysics, a guy who plays a naive realist on TV, the first member of Crocus Raven, and the host of the Jim Rutt Show. It's Jim Rutt. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Layman. Good to be back.
So, what's the status update? Where are we at in the Game B exodus from Facebook?
We are doing it. The Game B home, as we've decided to call it, is up and running, and we're now well past the tipping point where there's much more activity now on our own Game B home site than there was on the old Facebook group. So people want to check it out, game-b.org, and you'll be asked 3 questions. You got to answer them. And when it asks where you heard about it, you say on Layman Pascal's podcast from that asshole Jim Rutt. And if you leave the asshole out, we won't let you in.
So how many members have you got so far, and what kind of participation levels are you seeing from members?
Quite good. The total numbers as of this morning was about 800, and it's growing, continuing to grow rapidly. We'll pass 1,000 here in the next few days, and the activity level is great. It's interesting. The activity level is different than it is on Facebook, and it's in a good way. Probably the aggregate number of posts of comments is somewhat less because of the UI design, I think. But they're more thoughtful. They're more germane. The posts are more germane. This is something that I was not necessarily expecting, that the differences in the UI have actually resulted in a higher quality discourse, without a doubt. It's actually quite remarkable that the differences, which are moderate. Right?
What are those differences, and how do you think they're leading to that difference in quality of output?
It's not quite so straight. I mean, it's still very straightforward to make a comment, but there isn't this, box that's trying to, flash at you and encourage you to put out your every thought on everything. You have to kind of read through all the other comments and then put your comment in and all that sort of stuff. Also, the way the graphics are presented is a bit more subdued. It does have the preview functions. If you put a link to a article or a book or something in there, you do get a nice little graphic, but it's not as just grossly screaming at you. So I would say overall, the UI is cooler. It's a cooler UI. It is not designed to inflame. And that seems to be actually passing through to the discourse, which is good.
Yeah, that's definitely what I found in using it. And this is a great point you bring up, because I was going to ask you about the intersubjective vibe of the space. Like, are you getting the kinds of conviviality and mutual sense making that make you feel really optimistic that this could be, the launching point for something, or a growth vector for some kind of new community?
I think so. Again, it's too early to tell, because now there is one risk at going at your alone, is that people have to maintain the habit of visiting. Right? Most people go to Facebook every day, even though it's a waste of time and a toxic cesspool. It's a little harder to get that level of commitment on a new standalone site, but so far, so good. The other thing I love about it, and one of the reasons I chose the Mighty Networks platform, is it has very good group support that's integrated right into the platform. On Facebook, we had a real kludge where we had like 21 different Facebook groups that were loosely linked through some thing called the Game B homepage. Oh, damn. It was about the best we could do so that we could have special interests, right? Because the main group there was too much traffic in it. And so we, spun out Game B parenting, Game B education, Game B intentional communities, et cetera. In fact, let me pull up the current list of groups we have so far. And just in, 10 days, 2 weeks, we've spun up quite a few. One of the most active is Game B Literature. It's a brand new one. Books relevant to building Game B. Monetary systems in Game B. That's another new one. I don't even know how to pronounce this one. Atheopolis, Game B for cities. How Game B relates to life in big cities. Falling forward, learning from the past. What can Game B learn from previous efforts? political metamodernism in Game B, basically linking the Hansi Freinet communities and the Game B communities, of which there's a fair amount of overlap. Not 100% agreement, but we're stealing ideas from them, and they're stealing ideas from us. Just as people that are engaged in moving in generally the same direction often do. Game B in the nation states. One of the things that we have typically banned from the Facebook group is discussions of Game A politics or political campaigns or anything like that. But there's some discussions that should be had in that space. So we built a special group where people can talk about how Game B could or ought to or ought not to engage with the nation space. Talk about classic Game B project. Before we open this thing up to a broader public here in the next couple of weeks, we wanted to have created a really nice overview of what is Game B that could go on the landing page. And so rather than having the old warlords write one, we decided to create a writing project. It's called Writing Project, What is Game B? Explaining Game B in 5 minutes or less. It's actually, I think, the most active of all the groups currently, and the people are creating this document on a Google Doc that's linked in relatively organically into the group. 43 people working on it. Pretty cool. Permaculture in Game B parenting, help and answers. Just if you need help on something, pose it. The most active one is Game B intentional communities, 73 members. And then the always popular Game B projects, which was one of the most popular of the satellite groups over on Facebook, 72, where people basically provide updates on their projects, get perspective from other people doing Game B things, etc. And then last but not least, the Game B Social Club, place to hang out, loosen up, and be convivial. So for as short a time as we've been up, I think there's as many active groups as there were on Facebook after a year. So the group functionality is really nice over there on Mighty.
Terrific. And maybe it's a little bit too early, but what are you hearing from participants? What features do they really like? Are you hearing people pushing up against limits where there might need to be a modification to the structure or anything like that? What kinds of positive and negative feedback are you hearing?
I've heard nothing but positive, which is unusual, right? As somebody who's been building online systems for 40 years, God damn it. I've hardly ever seen a unanimity of positive. Lots of people comment on the UI, that it is cool, calm, and efficient, that the functionality that they want is there, that it's very easy to use. I'll give you another interesting testimony to the positive feedback. We also run another group called the proto-B incubator for people who are actually working on building on-the-ground communities to apply Game B living to. And we built that on Basecamp. And it was working. It was a quite vibrant community, much, much smaller, specialized community. And we did our monthly all hands video meeting earlier this week. And, the first thing people wanted to talk about is, can we move the proto-B incubator over to Mighty Networks? And we decided to do so. So all those people are members of also members of the Game B home. And they're unanimous, near unanimous, strong request was, hell, we'd love to have this thing moved over there. So I've already done that. We haven't opened it up yet, but we'll have a proto-B incubator, which will continue to operate as a private group by invitation only for people who are actually building or in the serious planning stages of building on the ground Game B community. So that's another testimony. People who have been using one of the old war horses, Basecamp, for several months now. Once they got exposed to the Mighty implementation, at least the version we created for Game B Home, wanted that for the incubator.
So far, so good then. Now, speaking of proto-B projects, 2021 is a special year for the prophet Jim Rutt. because this is the moment in his speculative future history when, given no extraordinarily civilization-wide collapses, that the proto-beehives are supposed to start their experiments in earnest.
And I believe it will happen. In fact,
Obviously, the GameBee social network platform has real potential to help make that an actuality. But I thought it might be good to take a step back and talk a little bit about what you call pre-B, the preliminary phase that lays the groundwork for the proto-B era. Maybe you could give us a kind of overview of the contours of the pre-B epoch.
Yeah, and that's where most of us, in fact, frankly, all of us are in today is proto-B. Is in pre-B. We don't yet actually have any proto-Bs up and running, though one of the projects in the incubator closed on its land in the last couple of weeks. So, yay. So we will make 2021. There will be at least one. I'm going to bet two on the ground proto-Bs who will open their doors by the end of the year. So it's happening. But most of us live in the pre-B world where we're trying to learn more about GameBee, create what GameBee is, because again, it's a self-authoring system. There is no book that says here is the doctrines of GameBee. It's something we're inventing from some very basic general principles, which we've had for quite a while. But that work continues, and we also are continuing to work on ourselves. I laid out in my essay, "A Journey to GameBee," a whole series of things that that we should be working on, prior to the proto-B epoch. Let's get our personal finances in order. Let's basically find the others and start to interact with them, not just online, but locally too. Now, I got to say, COVID's obviously thrown a damper on that. But once the cloud of COVIDs finally starts to, relax, maybe by this fall, maybe even the summer, if we're lucky, I'm going to strongly suggest, I think people are ready for it, start local chapters, right? Get together once a month and do a potluck dinner, and let's talk and, learn who else in your community is interested in this stuff, and what can you do together. Learn some skills, some skills that might be useful, on the land or in practical work. Build houses, do gardening, etc. So there's a number of things, and then we also talk about that people should work on their personal sovereignty, which is to learn how not to be dominated by Game A propaganda, and to be able to actually be a sovereign actor on one's own and one's community's behalf. So lots to work on here in the pre-B era. Nice.
Do you have kids, Jim?
I do. I have a daughter, and I now have a granddaughter.
Beautiful. Yeah, we got a couple, and so I'm in the GameBee parenting group. I'm really curious about the educational element, and one of the things that I think of a lot is even in a proto-B or early B era, when you're raising kids, there might be a lot of analogy between the pre-B skills and the skills you need to cultivate in children who are coming up to inhabit proto-B or early B civilizations.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct.
And I'm curious about what's your overall attitude towards education? Like, what have you seen work, like maybe with your own kids, but also in yourself? Because you're a guy who somehow in his life got up to speed, got ready for a GameBee type civilization. What worked in your education at school or at home, and what didn't work?
That's a good question. Those are two very different questions, I think. I had a very conventional, working class public school education, pretty good quality one, considering that 50% of the adults in our community were high school dropouts. Nonetheless, most of them were pro-education. Our public schools were pretty decent. So I had nothing special in my K-12 other than we had pretty good teachers. College, the usual shit. So I don't think formal education was a large amount of how I found my way to GameBee. It was, more through reading and thinking. And that's where our group GameBee literature, I think, is very useful. One of the books I recommend people start with is something called Seeing Like a State. It's a very interesting book. In fact, let me pull up the author's name here. Got so many interesting books already in this thing. God damn, where's mine? Yeah, Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott is a really interesting book. That was one of the things that opened my eyes to that there are other ways to see than to see like a nation state. I also, a lot of the reading I did on monetary theory. I mean, the thing that eventually led to the Emancipation Party and Game B was actually the research I did on alternative monetary systems, oddly enough. And so I may not be a good example because I've always been a self-learner, but that's how I got here, was just following my interest, and eventually it led here.
Okay. What about, give us a snapshot of what the proto-B epoch might look like if it goes well.
Well, I think that this is where it gets real interesting. One of the very important ideas about proto-B is there's no single formula. The idea is that people should create social operating systems for the scale of their proto-B, and they may differ quite considerably. Some proto-Bs may have most of their people doing work on in companies or industries on the proto-B site itself. Others may not. Some may be all, they may be in a very rural location, but doing all their work online, for instance. That's a model that people have looked at. Other ones where people would have a mix, where they'd still have day jobs in town, right? For ones that are closer to smaller or larger cities, et cetera. The other thing that's becoming very clear, looking at the projects in the incubator, is the continuum from essentially a residential subdivision plus all the way on to a full-on intentional community. And people are exploring along that complete dimension with, I think, a lot of the projects in between. You won't necessarily have, endless Saturday night governance meetings, et cetera. But then again, we encourage people to explore wherever along that continuum they can find people who want to join up and do it. As I say, the one project I might call the residential subdivision plus, everyone would own or rent their own individual property or apartment on the project, but there would also be a mandatory community supported agriculture component, and there would be a fair amount of shared infrastructure like office rooms, et cetera, that the people in the community could use. And then, on the other farthest extreme, one of the projects is a classic full-on intentional community where anyone who joins would also become essentially an employee of the group, employee-owned cooperative, essentially. And everyone would be in it together in both their living life, their working life, and would be substantially pooling their economics. So there's lots of room to explore. And I suspect that we'll find that there's more than one formula that works. We'll probably also find some formulas that don't work. But I think that's where I see the first phase is exploration. Then the next phase is we start to see things that do work and then start to become replicated. You mentioned crocus raven. I kind of laid out half facetiously in my document that one could think of proto-Bs kind of operating at two levels. One is the constitutional level. So we have a constitution. We'll call this one crocus, right? Which is how we're going to operate a proto-B. And then we have an actual on-the-ground instantiation, let's call it Raven, that uses the crocus constitution. Now, over time, if the crocus constitution turns out to be one that seems to work, those group of people and other groups of people may take the crocus constitution and propagate many of them. There might be dozens of them, hundreds of them eventually in the crocus line of lineage of proto-Bs. While there might be another lineage that uses a different constitution, different set of social operating system dynamics, and it may also be successful. It could be hundreds of those. And then the very interesting thing is, how do both the lineages operate within themselves? For instance, Jordan Hall is working on a concept called civium, which is a specific variety of proto-B, which sees many on-the-ground instances of the civium, all nonetheless being unified in a essentially business container. so that everyone who lives in all the proto-Bs would be employee owners of the Civium enterprise, in which would then do work in game A, as we talk about parasitizing game A by doing it better from using game B methods, and also, of course, working for the good of the people in the game B world. Famously, one of the ideas I push a lot is that childcare should be a built-in service in the proto-Bs that I like, at least. And so some percentage of people will be involved in childcare. Some people will be involved in education. May involve communal food preparation. Could well be gardening and farming, etc., as part of the Civium. So Civium is one particular flavor of proto-B where we would expect each of the settlements to be strongly integrated in a cooperative business wrapper, essentially. So lots of ideas going on, and the time is about soon when we will put these to the test and see which, if any, of them actually work.
When I think about the proto-Bs, and in the back of my head, I always call them beehives. One of the questions I ask myself is, how is this similar or different from the history of communes, ashrams, alternative living projects? And there's some obvious differences, which is they're united under a shared vision. They're learning from each other's experimental successes and failures. And there's an emphasis on network thinking, which probably wasn't present in a lot of those early attempts. But what's your take on that? How do you see this as similar to or different from the history of communal alternative living experiments?
I think it's on a continuum with them, but as I just went through, our idea is much more pluralistic. So I would expect some of them to look a fair amount like, a 19th century communal living experiment where everybody lives together and, manages themselves by a consensus process, eats together, et cetera, works together, et cetera. While at the other extreme, some of them, as I mentioned, would be more like residential real estate development plus with some aspects of game B that's built in. And the fact that we're not doctrinaire, we don't believe we have the Bible on how to do it, I think is one of the things that differentiates us the most. Because in the reading I've done, it's amazing how doctrinaire most of these other projects were. We have the truth, God damn it, right? And we're taking a much more empirical, experimental approach to this thing. I think that's one big difference. The other, and I think this is, it's not true for all of these. For instance, the Israeli kibbutz was very good at this. We intend to aggressively offer services and products to game A, as we call it, parasitizing game A by outcompeting them. And I think that's, again, something that was relatively rare in the traditional intentional community vibe. I don't see most of the proto-Bs being hippies trying to figure out how little work they can do so they can spend their whole day smoking reefer, right? I expect a lot of proto-Bs will be relatively tightly wound and, will be quite productive and will literally be out competing the game A alternatives in the categories they choose to compete in.
It reminds me a little bit of some of the medieval monastery systems where they're producing the best beer or the best honey and selling it to the communities. I think there's been a problem with a lot of, let's say, meta-level communities where their monetary idea was to just tithe the people who are interested in the ideas, right? Charge them for access to these exciting new ideas rather than do something like the monasteries did, which is have communities produce something that can outcompete the local game A system and use that to fund people who are interested in these new ideas.
And I'm strongly of that variety. Now, I do expect, and at least one of the proto-B projects is talking about having affiliate members who, supporting members who aren't actually on the ground, but, or pay $100 a month to have access to some of the ideas and come visit and that kind of stuff. But I don't believe that's how you build to scale. Right. That's essentially lifestyle tourism. And in some places it'll help. And I expect at the margin, at least, it'll be part of many of the early proto-Bs where, let's say, for instance, you're building out 50 housing units. You might keep 3 or 4 of them to be Airbnbs, essentially. It has 2 benefits. One, it's nice cash flow. And second, it exposes people to the experience. But I, at least for any project I personally got strongly involved with, I would not want that kind of stuff to be the main basis of economic life. I believe that the economic life for proto-B to prove that it's viable, has to be making real products, real services, and making them better than the Game A alternative so that people will buy them.
So what's your guess about initially where people with Game B type consciousness and Game B type social organizations are likely to be able to outcompete Game A?
I think that some of the ones we've identified, in fact, I've got a document online, which I haven't published yet, that I've been working on for a while, that lays out some of them. But I think that anything where self-organization is a good idea or an important part of the work. One of the ones I've used as 2 examples, or 2 extremes actually, in types of industry. One is an ad agency, right? Wait a minute, what could possibly be more Game A than an ad agency, right? Trying to manipulate people to buy shit to increase their status. Well, there's a big industry there, and it's a talent-driven industry. And unfortunately, it's a talent-driven industry in a very exploitive fashion, where the partners take all the profit. They bring people in at very low wages, burn them out. They become very cynical, et cetera. And it strikes me that a employee-owned ad agency could actually be pretty damn cool in the Game B world. Now, we'd of course have some ethical considerations about the type of customers we take in, et cetera. But I think we could get some of the very best and brightest writers and artists and conceptualizers to work for a Game B ad agency. And the other extreme, I've frequently talked about an auto repair business as a good example where Game B can outcompete Game A. As many of us know, while there are some good ones, and I know a few, the auto repair industry is rife with rip-off artists, people that, sell, unsuspecting grannies, services they don't need. They give you parts that they claim are the original factory parts, but are actually cheap knockoffs. They charge you book rate, which may or may not correspond at all to the number of hours that were actually spent working. And having worked in the auto industry a little bit first out of college, there's all kinds of conflicts of interests internally between the parts department and the mechanics. The parts department are always trying to push on the mechanics, buy as many parts as possible. The mechanics are saying, no, I'd rather spend time trying to fix, the car rather than having to just slap on parts. And unfortunately, the ethos these days has kind of gotten to the just slap on parts till you find something that works. I could see an employee owned where nobody has any incentive to sell parts versus labor and to work out what's the honorable and ethical thing to do for the customer to provide the most value. And if we're able to do that and then franchise it so that proto-Bs all over the country and eventually all over the world offer as one of their businesses Game B Auto Repair, and the Game B brand stands for honest, high-quality work that's not distorted by Game A game playing, I could see that being hugely successful.
That sort of internal contradiction between the parts people and the mechanics makes me think of the relationship between doctors and pharmaceutical corporations. Where one person's trying to urge a substance as a solution, and the other person's trying to do an analysis and repair job.
Yep, very similar.
I wonder whether, medicine is an area, healing, that kind of thing is an area where Game B could exceed due to its ability to take more comprehensive viewpoints and have more collaborative relationships between different kinds of modalities, things like that. And also, like you were saying about the auto body shop, that emergent reputation for high integrity. And I think maybe healthcare could be an area, given whatever the rules about healthcare are in any given system.
Yeah, that's the problem, of course, highly regulated. That's interesting. I'll add it to my list. Some of the other ones I have on my list are, ripping on the auto business. How about a Game B used car business, right? Another one famous for its scurviness, right? But suppose you were honorable and ethical and gave a year warranty and, full disclosure and all that good stuff. Another one, a healthy fast food chain, right? Again, sounds almost oxymoronic, but I think it could be done.
Wait a minute. Is all of Game B just a way for Jim Rutt to get back at that auto body shop he worked at?
Actually, I had a good time at that place. I liked it. But anyway, another one I think actually very high up, and I think if I were to pick one that I was going to push on, an Upwork Game B. Upwork is an online matching service for contractors and employers, and it's a little bit dodgy and a little bit exploitive. They take a pretty big cut out of the paychecks of the people. I could see one that was owned by guilds, right? So you'd have the Python programmer guild, you had the PR guild, you'd have the, ghostwriter guild, et cetera. And they would establish some standards and some prevailing rates for the people within their guilds. And then the guilds would collectively own the platform that was essentially a gig economy matching service for employers and freelancers. I think that would be a great Game B project. And again, honorable, ethical, transparent, employee owned, all the hallmarks of Game B. I think there's room for a Game B book publishing company. Let's see, elder care. There's another industry that's full of exploitive stuff going on. Child care. Here's another one of my favorites. A Game B phone. Our telephones are so addicting for us. You can actually do private label phones relatively easily. And I'd love to put on a infrastructure on a phone that basically requires you to appoint your own personal board of directors that has to approve any additional apps on your phone. And was inexpensive, but fully functional. And was supportive of your developing your better self, improving your sovereignty, not subvertive of it. So I got a long list. I got 25 in my list. I've added healthcare, and I'm sure there'll be lots of others that people will bring to it. But things where people working together in good faith can do a better job with employee ownership and with a brand equity around transparency, quality, and honesty. I think those are the kinds of places where we could explore. And, again, these things are not hippy dippy. This is real stuff, right?
Let's talk a little bit about the ability to see into network structures, because network thinking is one of the pillars of the Game B approach. It's one of the things that might distinguish Game Bs from 19th century social experiments. It's also like in your own education, you were saying your readings and, autodidactic kind of educational development. But obviously you started to tune yourself into the emerging field of complexity and network thinking. And obvious networks have organized the universe for a long time, but it's pretty recent that they started to enter human consciousness or human social systems, that they became something that we were aware of thinking about. Right, that we used to think about the mushrooms, and now we think about the mycelium, so to speak.
God, I love that. Great
right?
Analogy.
But still, there's a lot of people, our fellow citizens, who have a real difficult time seeing into that, and their responses to politics and economics are based on a pre-network understanding of the world. So, how do we cross that divide? What are the key insights or experiences that pre-B people or B adjacent people or any of our fellow citizens need in order to start taking networks more seriously?
Yeah, great question, and I think it's one of the things people could start doing right away. Well, the first thing to understand in terms of what you could do starting tomorrow is that the current forms of the networks that many of us deal with are very addicting and are detrimental in many ways to our mental health and to the information commons. And some of the little things I do is I take Sunday off, right? No interactivity at all on Sundays. The only thing I allow is a Kindle, but I don't allow myself to buy a new book on my Kindle, right? So no phones, no computers, no pads every Sunday. I also am fairly well known for taking 6 months a year off of social media every year from 1st of July to the 1st of January. no Facebook, no Twitter, no none of the other. Occasionally, I'll look around in some new, fresh systems just to see what's going on. But don't get oneself habituated to living on them damn things where it's your only source. So that's the avoidance side. I mean, just start realizing these things are like cigarettes, right? These things are like alcohol. My father gave us a bunch of good rules to live by on alcohol. He came from a family where half the males were alcoholics. Fortunately, he was not one of them. But he coached us from a very earlier age how to think about alcohol. Never drink to offset a hangover. Never drink before noon. It's amazing. In my whole life, I probably had a drink before noon 5 times, So I'm not one to have mimosas at brunch. It's just, Herbie said that wasn't right, so I don't do it. We should develop, I think, similar kinds of prophylactic behavioral rules with respect to the current toxic variety of networking that we have. Now, on the more positive side, we need to build networks that aren't designed to hijack our attention, that aren't designed to press our dopamine buttons, et cetera. And I would, put forth that the Game B home is an example of that. It doesn't have that toxicity to it. And I expect that we'll be building lots more such things. For instance, proto-B will no doubt have its own local network for people to do their governance on, to find out what's happening, and just, of course, to organize social events and things of that sort. And then we start thinking about the relationships between proto-Bs and then the relationships between pre-B people and the proto-Bs. And we could see a whole series of networks that need to be built to allow high quality interaction in a pro-developmental fashion. So, like that's some of my take on it. And then to your other point, part of it's educational. We certainly need to start educating kids from a young age that we live in a network world. I mean, one of the foundational perspectives of Game B are that it's, self-organizing, decentralized, network-centric, and meta-stable. And we need to explain all those things to young folks, in particular the network centricity, that, networks are a new thing and they allow us to get super linear scaling from smaller units. If we're right, particularly if Jordan Hall was right with the Civium idea, we can get the super linear development of good things that come from big cities, like more patents, more books being published, et cetera, and not have all the negative things that come with big cities. If we're able to have our small, high quality of life proto-Bs be strongly interconnected with each other in a way that we can capture the synergies of large numbers of people working together on projects and yet still live in beautiful, smaller communities.
Terrific. Well, I just want to throw this out there. If people listening want to start working on Canadian proto-Bs, especially ones where I run a whiskey distillery, contact me. We'll start working it out.
Yeah, that's not a bad business. I think breweries for sure. Whiskey businesses are heavily regulated. Whiskey's a terrible business for a startup because you got to age a damn shit, right? If you're going to get into the distillery business, you probably want to start with gin, right? Something like that. I think there's 100 bespoke gin distilleries in London now. I think that's a better business, actually.
Actually, my girlfriend's always wanted to start a gin distillery. We live in Thunder Bay, and there's a lot of amethyst in the ground. So she wants to start one where you just put a piece of amethyst in each gin bottle, and then that's the thing. Game A will go for that.
Yeah, that's kind of cool, right? Who are the guys that put the worm in the bottle, right? Mezcal, right? So yeah, you have a gimmick. I love it. Yeah, and there are one of our proto-B projects is in Canada. It's in British Columbia, and they're honing in on property right now. And so, hey, if you're willing to move from Thunder Bay to BC, there may be
I grew up in BC. I just moved to Thunder Bay a couple of years ago, so I'm a BC boy.
Okay. Yeah, you don't sound like a Thunder Bayan, right?
So in the meantime, before the distilleries get set up and all the land gets purchased, you could give us a synopsis of what maybe the early B epoch looks like, if the proto-Bs work, if the experiments pay off, if we can exchange information about what works. Where does it end up? What does civilization look like as it starts to turn onto a B mode?
Yeah, imagine, okay, this is really interesting. Of course, this is more speculative, right? We're compounding speculation on speculation. And I always want to remind people that a game B value is epistemic humility or modesty. That, as Yogi Berra said, predictions are hard, particularly about the future, right? And more so about complex adaptive systems than about, linear kinds of things. And so this is speculative, but let's imagine a region, and I'll just imagine for fun, the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, which I live fairly close to. Beautiful land, quite rich. There's a number of small cities there. Good place to live. Let's suppose in 25 years, 25% of the population are living on proto-Bs, either out in the rural areas or in the city, because there's also people thinking about how to do proto-Bs in cities, and no reason you can't. And it's now a significant voting block, frankly. 25% swing votes, enough to put any politician you want into office. So they have to start to provide things that we want. For instance, Virginia does not have good charter school rules. I could see as we get to the early B epoch being a strong enough force to be able to have really nice charter school regulations. I also like to see us apply our clout to things like building codes, right? And of course, we'll be doing that from the very beginning. Turns out that's the hardest part of getting a proto-B launched is the land use regulation and building code stuff. Where, it's not because they're maliciously trying to suppress proto-Bs, it's just because they're old fashioned, right? And you have to go through a whole exceptions process and all this. So over time, I see more and more of that going away. And so it becomes real easy to start a proto-B. It's no longer a nightmare of dealing with the planning board and the health department and the building inspector. They know what we're up to. They're supportive of it. We've helped elect politicians that appoint them. And so the world is now moving towards the proto-Bs and game B just being easier and easier. Further, and this is key, and again, it's speculative. One of the hypotheses is that we will indeed learn how to build these game B ventures that are employee-owned and self-managing that can outcompete game A. And if that is indeed the case, then the growth of proto-Bs and early B will be exponential as we just outcompete game A in industry after industry. And young people coming out of college say, do I want to work for a top-down command and control organization where my boss is an asshole and they get all the profit? Why the hell would I do that when I can go to work for a better company where I'm an employee owner and where I live in a community where I have a wonderful way of life and where I'm not being programmed and forced into competing for status with material possessions? Why would I do that, right? And once you see that tipping point occur, that's when we start to move into the early B world, and we're on our way to full-on game B. And I'm excited about it. Hopefully I'll live that long. Who knows, right?
I'm excited about it too, and I hope you're around for it. I know you just had a nice conversation with Zach Stein about hierarchical complexity. And so I know you're familiar with, concepts of like stratified and folded levels of complexity. And a number of people like Jean Gebser and Ken Wilber and the spiral dynamics, people draw a social, anthropological, historical analogy to those kind of Piagetian cognitive developmental phases, so that they look back on the normal history of game A and they subdivide it into, you got your tribal, you got your ethnocentric, you got your modernist. So what's your take on that? Do you think it's valuable to subdivide game A into layers of different modified operating systems? They have a lot in common, but they also have some real differences. Or do you think it's more useful to think of game A as a sort of homogeneous block?
I would say neither, actually. I see game A as having evolved, like everything else, along many different dimensions in many different ways. And while these gross blockings into pre-modern, modern, postmodern, metamodern, or whatever the hell you want to do, are vaguely useful, I don't think they tell us a hell of a lot. I'd rather look at the evolution of specific things, like let's look at the evolution of monetary systems in finance. Let's look at the evolution of the game of science. Let's look at the evolution of technology and manufacturing. Let's look at the evolution of energy, its production and transmission and consumption. And that those things are probably much more useful than this, gross chunking of, they don't hurt, they're sort of true, right? But they're not very, to my mind, useful, actually. What I find more useful in these toolkits is the integral folks have this 4-quadrant model. And I'm brand new to reading the integralists. I've read one book on it called The Brief History of Everything by Ken Wilber. And Ken's going to come on my podcast one day, his health allowing, but it's not allowed it for a while. Well, some of this stuff, as you can imagine, I find metaphysical rubbish and I'm not too interested in. The 4-quadrant model I actually now use. I find that a useful tool. The other one I find useful is Hansi Freinek's political metamodernism and his distinctions around code, hierarchical complexity, state, and depth. And again, it's a lens, and I find that useful for thinking about a lot of things in our Game B space. But what I don't do is turn any of them, I don't reify any of them. I don't say these are reality. I say these are lenses. And are they useful? Use them. And when they're not useful, don't. But don't, at least personally, I tend not to take these systems and swallow the pill. Rather, I look at them as a set of techniques and viewpoints which either are useful or are not useful, or are useful in part and not useful in other part. For instance, the integralists, I got no use at all for their cosmic consciousness. Sounds like total nonsense to me, right? I pull my metaphysical pistol out. And on the other hand, I find the 4-quadrant model very useful, the levels model a bit less useful, but somewhat. And so, look at the tools and pick and choose. And make sense of the world that we're embedded in with various tools, and where necessary, invent your own.
Yeah, there's definitely a danger in over-reifying the abstractions that emerge from seeing general analogies between interpretations. The 4-quadrant model is pretty useful on some things. Jean Vervaeke has a 4 ways of knowing pattern, and they map pretty closely to the integral 4 quadrants. When you can see that and go, oh, that means that's part of the underlying nature of reality. Now, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's not very important to think that it is.
Exactly. I just think it is not, right? The one of the easiest errors for people to fall into is to mistake the map for the territory. The territory of existence is remarkably fine-grained and unbelievably complex. And our lenses are coarse grainings and simplifications to allow our fairly stupid selves to be able to make operational decisions on how to live in the universe. And we have to always keep that in mind. These are simplifications because we're dumb. If we were a lot smarter, our lenses could have finer granularity. Instead of 4 quadrants, we could have 256 quadrants, right? But we're too stupid to think about what the hell you do with 256 quadrants. But an AI might not be. Or the people from Alpha Centauri, who knows?
If
right?
Most of the patterns in existence roll out to something like infinite complexity.
Exactly. They are.
I mean, all we can do is use these little geometric variables that we're familiar and comfortable with now. And we've got to judge them not by how much they impress us, but by how much leverage they give us over outcomes.
Yeah, the word I use, anyone who listens to my podcast knows, useful, right? That is my lodestar. Is X useful? If it's not useful, fuck it. I don't care what its heritage or what authorities say it's wonderful. If it is useful, use it. I don't care who invented it, right? Whether it's politically correct or not. If it's useful in living in the world, in helping us make decisions, because what is it that an animal is, right? It's someone who has perception, who has memory, of two kinds. One is memory based on experience and perception, and the second is essentially genetic memory, which has been programmed in over 500 million years of evolution. And what is the purpose of perception, memory, and cognition? Is making decisions in the world. And useful then is the lens you say, which parts of that puzzle help me make better decisions in the world, and that's all I have to say about this stuff, right? As I say, I don't believe it. It's fundamental to the reality that there's exactly four ways to look at shit, right? I say, well, that's more likely it's human cognition is limited to the famous Miller 7 plus or minus 2 working memory limitation, and we actually have a working memory limitation of 4 for images. And so things in the range of 4 to 7 are due to the fact that we're basically, to the first order, the stupidest possible general intelligence, and are not attributes of the universe themselves.
Okay, well, human intelligence, the artificial intelligence we might need to make sense of more complex patterns than we're capable of perceiving. But another form of intelligence that fascinates me is collective intelligence. I gave a talk a few years ago where I even argued that quantum mechanical systems could be understood as a basic layer of collective intelligence, because in most interpretations, you need to calculate all the other things the electron might be doing in order to figure out where this electron is likely to be, which makes it sound like there's a socially distributed intelligence in that system about this particular electron. So you can interpret the universe as being built up in layers of collective intelligence. You could even imagine them at simple physical layers. Certainly they're in biological layers. We got swarms, we got dominance hierarchies, we got our tribes and nations and our contemporary quasi-democracies. I'm curious about, based on the ideas you've played with, what do you think is limiting our democracy at the moment? What are the basic bugs in the electoral software that make it less useful than it could be?
They are many. And of course, keep in mind that our constitutions were designed in the 18th century, mostly, in the British case, the 17th century. And so it's no surprise that our institutions are out of congruence with the nature and the shape of the problems that we have today. One of my pet hobby horses is something called liquid democracy. I've written about it a fair amount. One of my essays, an introduction to liquid democracy on Medium, has gotten a lot of readership, somewhat to my surprise. So if people are interested in that alternative, it's worth looking at. And in liquid democracy, we get rid of elected officials. Essentially, every person is their own potential legislator, though we are realistic and realize most people don't have the interest, the aptitude, the time, or the knowledge to actually be an effective legislator. So you can then proxy your vote on any of, let's say, 30 or 40 issue areas to somebody else. So maybe you proxy your education vote to your third grade teacher who was the best teacher you ever had, right? And maybe she reproxies it to a group of high quality educators, right? And so the proxies can flow down. Or you proxy your defense vote to your uncle's retired Air Force colonel, or maybe to your Quaker minister, who would be an interesting choice for your defense vote. And this way, there are no elections, and essentially the way the proxies flow is how the legislation eventually gets done. And the beauty of it is it no longer forces you to a bad bargain of bundle A or bundle B, of which you may well disagree with a lot of stuff in either bundle. I know I certainly do. When I look at the shit show of America's Team Red and Team Blue politics, I go, bleh, I'll pick one of them, but it's definitely the lesser of two evils. And it's certainly, they don't represent who I am. While liquid democracy could exactly represent who I am. If I happen to, have a, kind of idiosyncratic collection of what I think is true or interesting or important, I can model that almost exactly. Give my environmental vote to the Sierra Club, give my gun control vote to the NRA, right? Neither party would represent that combination, but under liquid democracy, you could get there. On the other hand, as we talked about earlier, epistemic humility or modesty, in all my writings about liquid democracy, I say, don't try it at the nation state level first. It sounds like a good idea, God damn it. But there may be some really unintended consequences. So I've been encouraging people to try it at the city level or the organization level. Try it at your local Rotary Club, and we'll see. But that's just one example of how we could massively update our social operating system. Forrest Landry has some clever ideas also on how to do governance for smaller groups, say at the level of a proto-B. And some of his writings on group management are very interesting and worth people looking into. I can send you a link I don't know if you guys have an episode page. You can put it on your episode page. But there's a tremendous amount of thinking that needs to be done to upgrade governance at every level. Nation state governance, corporate governance, things like holacracy may be a much better way to run a company than command and control top down, employee ownership as opposed to anonymous stockholder ownership. Just so many different improvements that we can potentially make in governance.
Fabulous. I would recommend that anybody who's interested in the future of collective intelligence check out those articles on liquid democracy and try to wrestle with the concept, because there's some really interesting approaches in there. When I was a kid, one of the first thoughts I ever had about enhanced democracy was just sort of stratified direct democracy, where everybody gets their vote, but if you can prove you actually know anything about the voting question, then maybe your vote counts as 5 or 10. And maybe, the elected representatives, their vote counts as 100,000, or the president has the largest voting block, but everybody's in the same vote every time when they want to be. But the thing liquid democracy does that goes beyond something like that is it allows people to proxy out their vote, which is hugely important because most people don't want to spend most of their time focusing on this stuff. They want to make qualitative evaluations of other people, and to be able to pass that on and be able to treat yourself not as a single voter, but as essentially a dynamic plurality of subvotes. I think that definitely raises the level of the collective intelligence.
Yeah, I think, and people say, well, someone will give them to dumb people. I go, yeah, they will, but probably people less dumb than themselves.
That's right. So, and that's already happening. I mean, dumb people are doing dumb things right now. That's not a danger of future systems.
Yeah. So, maybe my uncle isn't quite the optimal guy to give my defense vote to, but he probably knows more about it than I do. So, as I suggest, even if the gradient towards greater knowledge and expertise is not so steep, it's probably in general up. And so we should expect better collective decision making from liquid democracy than our current system. And of course, it would be great not to have the airwaves full of noise from Team A and Team Red and Team Blue, every 2 years. You guys in Canada have a somewhat different cycle, but and not quite as bad a shit show. But why the hell do we need all that noise that's reduced to nothing? It's basically propagandistic techniques. No real talk about substance. Liquid democracy gets rid of all that. It's at least conceptually a very interesting system. And of course, more broadly, collective sense making isn't just about replacing electoral politics. As I alluded to before, a classic collective decision-making opportunity is in how we run businesses and how we run our local communities. The governance layer applies everywhere, because essentially, we have operating systems every place. Our private organizations, our churches, our companies, they all have social operating systems. And all those things can use a rethink.
Yeah, that seems to be one of the benefits of thinking in terms of networks, is you stop putting things like business and government in different categories and just start thinking of them as social operating systems at different scales.
Yeah, they're coordination systems to do social work, right? Say a business takes in raw material and creates a product, right, that somebody wants and distributes it at a price people are willing to pay, or provides a service, et cetera. Government aggregates some balance of things that people want from their government versus what they're willing to pay for. So they're social coordination systems to address different classes of problems, but at the higher level of abstraction, they're all the same thing, right? Different flavors of the same thing. And that's a very important insight. That's a key insight from, as you say, taking a network-centric view of social operating systems.
You mentioned Landry's attempts to think through the way people organize themselves. And I know he's tried to map his trifecta structure onto meritocracy, consensus, and democracy by having them work together in different phases of community self-organization. I haven't, at least, read a lot of thinking from him about the actual voting mechanisms. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about how the vote is done. There's plurality, there's majority, there's winner take all, there's ranked choice, there's proportional representation, there's, we could average out results if we have people vote differently, right? Yeah. So do you have a sense of what's potentially a smarter way to actually do votes in the democratic phase of our social organization?
Well, it's interesting that there's a mathematical proof that no voting system is the best. I forgot the mathematician, a guy named Don Sari at Berkeley is an expert. Don Sari, S-A, anyway, I can give you his name, is a mathematician of voting systems and is up on all that stuff. Personally, I like ranked choice. I think ranked choice is a very interesting system. You can prove it's not perfect, and there can be results that are irrational, but not nearly as bad as our one vote first past the post. And for people who don't know about how ranked choice works, is let's say you have two people running, or you have four people running for mayor, and you can vote for one or all four of them, and you rank your choices. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Say I vote for all four of them ranked, or typically 3. Usually you don't vote for ones you don't, the last one you don't want, but let's say you vote for 3. The first round is everybody's first choice vote is calculated. And then the candidate with the least number of votes in the first round gets dropped. And everybody that voted for them, number 1, the pointer goes down to their number 2 choice. And then those votes are allocated, and the lowest candidate drops off. Then you have 2, and then this person's next level of votes are reallocated. And then that point will tell you who wins. Now, actually, we used that system when I was in college at MIT for all of our student elections. And we just thought that was the coolest. And the city of Cambridge, where MIT is located, adopted it for their municipal elections. So it's actually been tried, and I think it's being adopted in some states now. I believe the state of Maine has recently gone to ranked choice voting for statewide offices. And I believe it's while not perfect, certainly a big improvement over pick one type democratic machinery.
You've got a neat article on Medium about the fifth attractor, based on this idea that our perturbed and unstable combination of social forces could settle down at some point into a place that isn't necessarily feudalism, fascism, or a new dark age. The idea of attractors is interesting. It's a little bit ambiguous because obviously it has a good scientific description. It has a sort of geometric slope of probabilities angle, but it certainly feels like an already existing future that haunts us and pulls us toward it. So let's talk about telos and teleology a little bit. It's certainly pretty preposterous to think that a force from outside the cosmos enters into the cosmos and has a goal that is both real and intelligible to us so that we should act on. Yeah. But at the same time, we can look at the evolution of the cosmos and say that the mechanisms of mutation and adaptation and culling periodically produce a new emergent regime. And this has happened a bunch of times. And it sort of looks like there's a trend to all that. And that maybe there are trends built into the probabilities of the universe just because of the combinations of basic parameters of reality will steer things in a certain direction over time. right? And that's at least a not initially stupid understanding of what a telos might be. What's your take on that? Is there an intelligible potential directionality of deep history, or is that mostly a form of regressive thinking?
Well, I think you have to break this down into more specific things. One trend that many people believe the universe shows is an increase in complexity over time. And there's some reasonably good arguments to say that we should expect that, at least for a while. In 10 trillion years, when all the stars burn out, maybe we'll have a reversal of complexity. But as long as the stars continue to provide a flux of energy, there's probable, reasonable reason to believe that over the long haul, complexity ought to increase. On the other hand, all this stuff has to be thought in the context of evolution, essentially. And evolution doesn't always move forward. There can be regressions for sure, either exogenous regressions. Think about the asteroid that hit the Earth 65 million years ago and wiped out the dominant life form, which was dinosaurs. Now, of course, their ancestors survive as birds, but they're not the big old thunder lords that we had before. Even without catastrophe, there's no guarantee that forward is the direction of evolution in any given case. In fact, it's interesting, Homo sapiens, us, advanced modern Homo sapiens have 10% smaller brains than Cro-Magnon man did about 30,000 years ago. It may be that our soft living since the invention of agriculture has allowed us to be somewhat stupider than we were. And of course, some of the current social, political, and cultural trends tend to reinforce that view. Personally, I don't believe there's from somebody from the outside coming in, playing all the strings and playing us marionettes at all. However, as an empiricist, give me some proof, goddammit, and I'll take a look at it. But I do think that there's a reasonable argument for on average, increase in complexity over time, so long as there's a big energy flux. But we can't count on it saving our ass in any given case. Every evolutionary branch can regress or move in directions that are surprising. For instance, the whales are evolved from similar lines to cattle. Who would have thought of that? But, that's how our evolution took. The ancestors of cattle, some of them ended up going back to the sea. What a strange thing. Is that a movement forward, backward, sideways? I would say that the idea, are they higher complexity, lower complexity? I don't know. They're just different. And so this increase in complexity is over, longer periods of time. And we can't count on it in saving our effort to save our ass. We have to do that ourselves.
We don't know. Obviously, there's local regressions. We also don't know if any of the apparently progressive trend lines are actually very local and will go back in another direction. And we certainly shouldn't think very simplistically about the notion of forward when it comes to evolution.
No, to get on a more hopeful scale, humans are the first species in our evolutionary tree to get past the line of general intelligence. We are now in a domain of cultural evolution, which is both very fast and very powerful. And that's both a good thing and a bad thing. It means that we can do miraculous stuff, but it also means that we can destroy ourselves with a wrong move. So I think that views about the unfolding of cultural evolution are ones that we'll know a hell of a lot more in a few thousand years. But it's the game we're playing, and we got to be good at it. Who was it? Stuart Brand said, "We now have the power of gods. We better get good at it," right? And that's, of course, very close to the core of the Game B ethos, is that we are in a meta crisis. If we play this wrong, we could, at worst case, kill off all life on Earth. More likely, we could cause the collapse of advanced civilization and a regression to, small bands, warlordism, etc. On the other hand, we have the power to not go there also if we're smart enough not to do so.
Are you going to take 6 months off each year from the Game B social networks?
It's funny you mentioned. I was just thinking about that the other day, and I don't know. The answer might well be yes. I have found it's also been very good for the Game B community for me to disappear for a while. It helps, younger generation voices come up. New people take on leadership and managerial responsibilities, etc. And so I think it's, kind of good for the movement actually to have many of us OGs disappear, and eventually the next generation take on the work. And disappearing 6 months a year I've been doing it for quite a while, and the world has not ended. So the answer is I haven't fully decided, but if I were to decide right now, because I always train my business people in my companies to always, if someone asks you, what would you decide right now? You better have an answer, even though you reserve the right to study further before you actually do it. I would take if I decide right now, I'd take the 6 months off.
You are, let's say, the poster boy for the anti-spirituality phrasing of the meta-level civilization and personal transformation. And I like that because I think we need a strong diversity of terminology. And there's obvious dangers to spiritual phrasing, is that it tends to invite soft-headed regressive thinking and also call into our communities an element of people we might not want.
And cults. Watch out for the cults.
Exactly. Now, there's some superficial value to it in terms of like a sales technique, reaching out to people, putting ourselves verbally in alignment with traditions. And, an awful lot of the people in the world are already in that kind of phrasing. And even people within these communities grew up in a way that was very sympathetic to the esoteric and developmental aspects of religion. So we might want to continue that as a way of creating alliances outside the group and affirming people inside the group, or we might want to take a harder line. And I think both of those attitudes are a really good mix. My own take is usually that I don't want to give up the battlefield before the fight, so to speak. If I think of people as, I don't want people I think of as idiots getting to define a term and then I reject the term. I want to say I get to define the term in the best possible way according to me, and if they disagree, they're wrong about the meaning of the word. So that 90% of what people call religion, I'm like, well, that's not religious. I'm like those old prophets, and I'm like, you guys are doing religion wrong. It should be this. But that's a temperamental and linguistic attitude that I have, and I appreciate the disagreement and the complexity and the diversity of opinions on the subject in our communities.
Yeah, and then I think in Game B, we go out of our way to have a big tent on that, right? I think that's one of the things we learned from the original Game B 1.0 was that, we think basically fell apart about that exact argument. And now we've concluded, frankly, the way the Enlightenment did after the 30 Years' War, that we need to be a big tent and tolerate each other's views on this stuff. And I also find some very interesting, innovative work like John Vervaeke's The Religion That's Not a Religion. And Jordan Hall has participated in that, Greg Henriques and some others, that we can take things that have hooks into, say, folkways that have been supported religion over the years and remap them into more rational domains. And I think that's good work. It's not work that I'm temperamentally suited for, but I encourage it. And indeed, under what we call psychotechnologies, even full-on traditional religions, if they work for people, fine, right? And I think we need to be a big tent on this stuff. And if stuff's useful, then use it. But personally, not for me. If you got the proof, God damn it. My local pastor, who I'm good friends with, real smart lady, actually had her on the podcast one time of the Presbyterian Church. She said, Jim, what would it take for you to become a believer? And I said, all right, here it is, Beth. Give me 2 weeks warning when good old God will cause the Washington Monument to rise 200 feet off its foundations rotate 3 times and settle itself back down with no damage. And I'll whip up a crowd of newspaper and TV and witnesses and all this shit. And if it works, I'm a believer. God damn it! And she goes, "You're an asshole." Or he doesn't work that way. I go, "Well, you asked me what it would take for me to be a believer," and so there it was. So I, as an empiricist, I do not rule out the possibility that anything that's logically possible is logically possible. But I just am temperamentally not interested in believing stuff without evidence.
It's interesting the way, to me, that some people connect belief, religion, and spirituality very tightly, and other people don't connect those very much at all. Like, I didn't grow up with any kind of religious indoctrination, so that's a pretty privileged position. I can stand back and have a very positive view of religion because it never did anything to me personally. And then when I got involved in the integral post-metaphysical spirituality discussions and organizations, a lot of that is looking at different developmental phases and saying, oh, we over-identify religion with one phase, which is what Gebser called the mythic membership society, right? And so we think religion is identified as big blocks of people who believe in a particular dogma or legendary tale, and they preferably profess membership to this mythic membership group. And then when modernity came around, people looked at that and said, oh, I guess that's what religion is. I don't like that. But when we take this zoom out, we go, okay, whatever religion is and spirituality as phenomenon, interpersonally and intrapersonally, it's got to be true for Paleolithic humans, tribal humans, mythic membership groups, modern humans, postmodern, metamodern, whatever all those things are that we happen to accept. So it's interesting for me personally to abstract a process out of all that and leave each of those operating systems and their typical languages aside, as well as their assumptions about the cosmology and ontology of reality, right? We take all of that stuff out and look for very simple patterns. And this is, Vervaeke and I have had, 4 or 6 or whatever conversations on this topic on his thing, because I think there is something really useful that we used to call religion and spirituality, but we absolutely don't need to call it that. We could call it anything we like. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, certainly we can do weird shit in our head, right? And as I've mentioned many times, I've had several mystical experiences. I can easily put myself into a mystical state for 30 seconds where my ego just goes away. I've tripped on LSD. I've done other hallucinogens. I've got a 36-hour protocol, which I can make almost anybody have a mystical experience. But my view is those are brain states. Those are brain-wide rhythms that are analogous to things like the default mode network and the task mode network, which are well-known organizational patterns, brain-wide organizational patterns. The default mode network is when we're daydreaming or, not particularly paying attention to something, or just kind of thoughts are just bopping around. And the other one, the task mode network, let's say you're changing the tire on a new bicycle that you don't really understand exactly how it works. And so you're like super intensely trying to figure out, how do I take this apart in a way that I can put it back together again? That's a classic example of the task mode network. And I believe there are networks like that in the brain, which are attractors, quite literally, that represent, I would say, at least 3 different mystical states. The first one is not that different than the default mode network, and it is addressable from the default mode network, which is why sitting quietly, if you've got any practice with it, can take you to an interesting new brain state. And then there's another one beyond that. And then I hypothesize that there's the really far out one that the people who are practitioners of, guys, 30 years of Tibetan sitting on a rock or whatever the fuck it is they do, can get their brains to get into that state for a little while. And that's all cool. If you want to call that spirituality, which some people do, I've got a friend, he and I sort of argue about it, but we sort of end up agreeing, though he just can't help himself to use the more religious language. I say, so long as you're willing to say that the subjective experience of mysticism is a brain state analogous to other brain states, and that they may be some of them may be very hard to get to. Hey, I'm with you. We don't disagree at all. But where I stop is I say that does not, as far as I know, give anybody any insights into the nature of the universe or anything else that isn't accessible some other way. It's just a brain state.
Yeah, sometimes I say meditation is not an ontology.
Meditation is a way to manipulate your brain, and it's good for you. I have a couple of little meditations that I do each day, and for different purposes. Both of them just last under a minute, and I find them useful, but I don't consider them magic.
My general view is that there's something that I would call spirituality in the individual and religionishness interpersonally, which is the ability of subjectively active subsystems to coordinate in a way that produces something like an excess coherence, or, a gestalt overtone that we can then enter into a relationship with. And we call that numinous experience spirit, right? And collectively we call it religious, and individually we call it spiritual, but it's a kind of enhanced coordination and coherence of the subsystems that are within us, or the bigger systems of which we are subsystems.
See, I would just call that communications.
Yeah, exactly. And we can call it anything we like.
All right. What is a social being? It's a being that communicates with other social beings, right? Yeah. And don't need no magic.
Exactly. And sometimes it seems like it's really working, and things get vivid, and there's this, we reach for poetic terms at the very least in order to express how good that feels and how powerful we feel when it's happening, and how much we feel that's the right way for people to be interacting. But again, most of the people I would call religious in human history did not call themselves religious. Even that's a fairly recent concept. And if an alien anthropologist came to the planet, what they think of as our religion might be very different than what we think of as the religious people, where there's almost a Dunning-Kruger effect, I think, where the people who are most likely to call themselves religious are probably the dumbest people, the worst at being religious, whatever that should mean.
Yeah. Personally, I just didn't get rid of the term religious, but
fair enough.
But if people find it useful, because I still guess I was raised a Catholic, and they probably biased me. But when I hear the word religion, I think magic, and I would believe in magic if someone could prove it, but otherwise, I'm not going to. And so I just find the word religion burdened by magic or supernatural stuff. I mean, something that is as useful as Buddhism, unfortunately, gets crapped up with stuff like celestial spheres and devas and all this horse shit. If you actually go back to the Pali canon, the stuff that old Gautama himself talked about, he specifically warns against metaphysical speculation, etc. But they can't help themselves. They have to crap it up with this metaphysical nonsense, right? It just seems to be a common human weakness. But it's one we can overcome. We're overcoming xenophobia. We're overcoming patriarchy. We're overcoming ignorance around scientific things. And I believe we need to overcome our belief in magic, and that we can. And then if we want to talk about what's going on inside of our heads and when we communicate with each other, we can talk about it in a sensible, realistic fashion.
One of the most widely cited Ken Wilber formulations is this pre-trans fallacy idea. And the major application of it is to say that people get confused about what's pre-rational and trans-rational. And both the critics of that stuff and the affirmers of that stuff, they don't make a very good distinction about what is at least rational, and then an attempt to build on that to include more things, and what's actually a bunch of pre-rational, magical, superstitious malarkey.
Exactly. You've probably heard me rant about it. When you talk about these color thingies that these people like to have in some of these spiral dynamics things, I say, fuck the spiral. It's an arch. Orange at the top. Orange men rule. To the left, more ignorant. To the right, more goofy. Right. And I think that's my interpretation of these color dynamics. Though, of course, I pick and choose. I believe I have useful tools from the green level and the teal level and all stuff. But, on average, I say, the goofiness increases as you go up the spiral. To the right, ignorance increases. To the left, orange men rule.
Right. Orange patriot Jim Rutt.
God damn it.
It's one thing to say these things are just brain states, mystical state. Now, I personally, what I want to mean by spirituality is almost the opposite of mysticism, because mysticism, it focuses on state change. And I think it's the integration of states that is the developmental higher capacity. Nonetheless, when we look at states, we could say just brain states, or we could say these brain states are correlated to some kind of subjectivity, which fits in with that quadrants thing. And I know you've been conducting a series of interviews about consciousness, and I'm curious what your take on it relative to brain states. I imagine you are open to somebody proving to you that consciousness is a pre-existing condition of reality that just has neural correlates, but you probably haven't seen that proof yet. Was that an adequate summary?
Yeah. In fact, one of the guests we had on the show, Christoph Koch, is a strong proponent of integrated information theory, which claims that consciousness is an inherent attribute of the universe, and that a rock is conscious and a light switch is conscious. Not what I would bet on, right? But Christoph Koch is a really smart dude, right? And Tonini, the actual inventor of IIT, is another really smart dude. And so who knows? Let's see the proof. They're doing some work right now that might produce some evidence. Personally, I'm a Searlean, John Searle, the philosopher from Berkeley. And what we call our human consciousness in the Searlean model is a purely biological mechanism, much like digestion. Searle himself describes it as like respiration or digestion. And then the Rutt corollary is that it also produces the same end product as digestion a lot of times, which is shit, right? And that it's expensive genetically and energetically. The brain is 20% of our energy budget, despite being only 2% of our mass, and perhaps 20 or 30% of that is to support the engine of consciousness. But I don't think there's anything. I just think it's a way that the brain operates to process, as we talked about before, perception and memory to solve problems in the real world, originally to allow us to successfully reproduce. And it's been around for quite a long while. Again, the Searlean school would say that consciousness goes back at least to the reptiles, and maybe a little bit further than that. May have evolved independently in the cephalopods, the squid and octopus. They have things that sort of seem like consciousness, but they're quite different. And there's an evolutionary gap between the lines. And so one didn't evolve from the other. They probably evolved independently. So that's what I'd call the nothing special school of consciousness. It's just what brains organized like ours are like. It feels like something to be, and different brains might not even have what we think of as consciousness. And Searle also warns that it's kind of sloppy thinking to say computer consciousness, right? On the other hand, what you can say is that a computer might have something that's analogous to consciousness. Now, you go back to digestion. In the pharmaceutical and food industries, there are these big things called digesters, right, which use fungi or bacteria to break down chemicals to produce either food products or chemical products, paper, beer, all those things. But the industrial digesters are nothing at all like the human digesters, right? They're your stomach, your intestines, your esophagus, etc. But they serve a similar function. And so I could imagine a computer consciousness being analogous to and being sort of generally like a consciousness, but it won't be the same really as a human consciousness. But we could call them both consciousness if we want to. But I'd be surprised if the IIT boys are right and that a rock is conscious. But I might be wrong.
That's right. I'm not even sure whether a rock is a thing that could be conscious or whether it's just a bunch of things.
IIT would say it is a thing.
Yeah.
And that it is different than the rock. Inside of the rock is different than the non-rock. Just as I strongly believe that like a human, you can actually draw a very fine line. What is me, right? Which is what part of me are in real-time circulation of gases, food, and the elimination of waste products and elimination of bad gases, which basically says my hair is not me, my fingernails are not me, and my teeth are not me, but my hair follicles are me. And I think using that fairly simple rule, you can draw a very tight line of what's me and what's not.
I've probably got one question left in my head to ask, but before I get there, is there anything else I should ask? Is there anything else going on in Game B or in Jim Rutt that I haven't asked about that's important? Is there anything you want to mouth off about that you haven't mouthed off about yet? Or if you were me, what would you ask you?
I think we covered a lot of ground here. There are things I could go off on some of my other projects, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. I would remind people, if you're interested in this stuff, game-b.org. Answer the 3 questions. Say we're not yet for broad public, but we're now doing some podcasts. And so people that are on Game B adjacent podcasts, like Layman's, we're inviting to come check us out.
Okay, here's my final question. People are not necessarily elders just because they get old. They might even be less wise when they're old, depending on what they've been practicing during their life. You strike me as being one of my legitimate elders in this sort of idea space. So I'm curious about who you think were your elders. Who was doing this kind of thinking? Who did you come across, whether in writing or in your real life when you were younger, who thought, yeah, that guy's onto something. There's a pathway there. That might be wisdom.
People always ask me who was my role model, and I say nobody I can recall. I picked and chose, again, like I do with systems. My parents were good role models in certain ways, but they were not intellectuals at all. But they were very good people, and they were very effective people. I had a couple of teachers that encouraged me. One in particular, my 10th grade biology teacher, was a really radical dude, right? And taught me that it was okay to really think outside the box and not give 2 fucks what the authorities thought. Let's see who else. One of my early bosses was one of the bravest people I've ever met in my life. Both intellectually and physically. If you're going to walk down a dark alley, I'd like to have this guy at my side. He would absolutely not run and leave you there. And he was just fearlessly, intellectually honest in business. I learned some Machiavellianism from another guy who was the lead investor and chairman of my first startup. In some ways, he was a good model of things not to do, but he was also a model of some things to do. So I would say I'm a eclectic borrower at a high rate. I don't point typically to any one or small number of people that I have borrowed from over the year. I borrow from everybody. Would John Lennon say, amateurs borrow, experts steal. So I could steal from everybody, essentially. In terms of the literature, oddly enough, Robert Heinlein. I learned a lot from Robert Heinlein. H.L. Mencken, there's another unlikely source, maybe not so unlikely in my case. I even learned a little bit from Ayn Rand. I went through my Ayn Rand period. Now I'd say no, but again, I'm sure some of those ideas have been retained. Those are some of my older, teenage type sources. And since then, I read 100 books a year. So, I'm borrowing all the time. So I guess my answer is I'm an eclectic learner, borrowed from all kinds of people.
Terrific. That's beautiful, Jim. It's wonderful to talk with you. It's always fun, very stimulating, and I'm a huge advocate of all the projects that are going forward, and everybody who's interested should try to get in on this Game B networking platform.
Well, that's great. Been great to be here. Thanks for inviting me back anytime.